On a fateful flight, an arrogant businessman insulted a black female soldier, driven by deeply rooted biases in his mind. Julian Prescott, self-assured with power and status, had no idea that the woman he dismissed was fighting battles of loss and sacrifice he could never fathom. But a headline the next day forced him to confront a bitter truth. He was wrong. Do you believe compassion can transform even the hardest hearts? Share where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to help spread meaningful messages. The PA system echoed through the expansive halls, announcing the approaching boarding time. Julian Prescott stood tall, hands buried in the pockets of his tailored trousers. His sharp gray suit exuded confidence, paired with a high-end leather briefcase and a gleaming watch on his wrist. His piercing gaze swept over the bustling crowd, hasty travelers, crying children, and hurried footsteps clattering against the cold marble floor. Glancing at his phone, Julian checked an email from his assistant, a final reminder about his critical presentation at the management conference in Atlanta. This was his moment, a chance to secure recognition from senior executives and unlock the doors to his dream position. He thought to himself, no room for error. As the PA system called for first-class passengers, Julian strode forward confidently, leaving the noisy crowd behind. He offered a faint, detached smile as the flight attendant welcomed him, then stepped into the narrow aisle leading to the first-class cabin, his home in the sky. The leather seats, crisp white headrest covers, and sparkling champagne glasses on small tables radiated a luxury Julian had come to take for granted. But as he approached seat 3A, his gaze faltered. The sight of the woman seated in 3B caught him off guard. She had short-cropped black hair, smooth brown skin, and wore a sharply pressed military uniform. Her attire exuded an air of strength and confidence that starkly contrasted with Julian's casual self-assurance. The name tag on her chest read, D. Parker. Julian sat in his seat, stowing his briefcase in the overhead compartment, but his eyes lingered on the woman beside him. A thought bubbled in his mind. How did she end up here? Probably another free upgrade. Soldiers always get preferential treatment. Danielle Parker nodded politely as Julian settled into his seat, but he responded with only a tight, reluctant smile. She seemed unbothered, focusing instead on a small book in her hands. When the flight attendant arrived, her warm smile was directed at Danielle. Thank you for your service, Sergeant Parker. If there's anything you need, please let us know. Julian raised an eyebrow, his lips pressing into a thin line. A vague sense of irritation rose within him. Here we go again, he thought. Everyone lavishes praise on soldiers, but do they work as hard as we do? Or is it just the uniform that earns them all this goodwill? Danielle replied with a measured, sincere tone, I appreciate it, but I don't need anything. I just hope for a safe flight. Her simple, heartfelt response only made Julian feel more challenged. He said nothing, but his sidelong glances brimmed with unspoken judgment. Danielle, seemingly unfazed, turned a page in her book, her posture straight and composed, maintaining a clear boundary with those around her. The first-class cabin settled into a tranquil hush, but inside Julian, a simmering irritation burned like a hot ember. Little did he know, this flight would forever change his perspective on life, sacrifice, and the value of the people he once underestimated. Julian leaned back in his seat, his gaze drifting toward the woman sitting beside him. That faint yet persistent feeling of unease he'd felt from the very first moment still hadn't subsided. Occasionally, his eyes would linger on Danielle's immaculate military uniform, every crease perfectly pressed, every badge gleaming, a silent symbol that only deepened his irritation. To him, everything about her exuded an unwarranted air of self-satisfaction. A flight attendant approached, her bright smile accompanied by a tray of drinks. When the orange juice was placed in front of Danielle with a polite, "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Parker. We truly appreciate everything you've done." Julian felt a sharp sting to his pride, as if thorns were pricking at his sense of self. Danielle nodded in acknowledgement, her voice low and composed. "I appreciate your thoughtfulness. It's nice to be welcomed like this." Julian took a sip of his water, the discomfort in his chest spreading as though he'd swallowed a block of ice. He avoided looking at her directly, yet his ears couldn't help but pick up every word of gratitude, every admiring glance directed her way. Always the same, he thought bitterly, a faint, sarcastic smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. People love putting them on pedestals like heroes. But has she really done anything extraordinary? Or is she just coasting on everyone else's admiration? Danielle, seemingly oblivious to Julian's simmering disdain, remained calm, reaching into her pocket to pull out a small photo. Julian glanced sideways, enough to see it was a picture of a young boy, around 8 years old, with bright eyes and a radiant smile, holding a soccer ball. Danielle held the photo gently, her expression softening as though the mere sight of it could dissolve all the fatigue of the flight or her work. To Julian, the silence that followed felt like a challenge, a deliberate, dismissive act that only fueled his irritation further. He tilted his head slightly toward Danielle, his voice cold, laced with insinuation. "Your son? He looks like he's pretty proud of having a mom in the military." Danielle lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting Julian's. In that brief moment, she detected the hostility buried in his tone. What seemed like an innocuous remark carried layers of meaning, a veiled jab, a question of her worth and the values she represented. She furrowed her brows slightly, but quickly regained her composure. Her voice remained steady and unshaken. "Yes, he's very proud." Julian leaned back, his eyes fixed on her. Her response echoed in his mind, an affirmation that only stoked his discomfort. He couldn't explain why her presence bothered him so deeply, but he knew that her confidence, her unflinching calmness, made him feel like he was being challenged. Right here, in what he considered his own domain, the first-class cabin. Danielle, on the other hand, paid no mind to Julian's scrutinizing gaze. She quietly slipped the photo back into her pocket, her eyes drifting to the window where clouds floated serenely by. Julian tightened his grip on his glass, saying nothing more. Yet within him, the irritation simmered like a low-burning flame, waiting for the slightest spark to ignite into something more. The flight was far from over, and he knew silence wasn't something he'd be able to maintain for long. The silence in the first-class cabin was broken when the flight attendant returned, her radiant smile lighting up the space. She leaned slightly toward Danielle, once again exuding an unmistakable air of sincerity. "It's such an honor to have people like you serve in our country. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you so much, Sergeant Parker." Danielle nodded, her lips barely curling into a faint smile. "Thank you, but I'm good. A safe flight is all I need." Such heartfelt gratitude, in another context, might have been nothing more than a kind gesture. But to Julian, it felt like sharp needles piercing his pride. He lifted his glass of water, swirling it idly in his hand, his sharp eyes glancing at Danielle as though searching for a flawed exploit. Finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. His voice rang out, cold and laced with sarcasm. "It's nice how simply wearing a uniform gets you special treatment." The atmosphere froze. A few nearby passengers cast subtle glances in their direction before quickly looking away, pretending not to have heard. Danielle, at first, didn't respond. She raised her gaze, her eyes meeting Julian's with a calm yet piercing intensity. "What did you say?" Her tone was steady but firm, giving no room for compromise. Julian tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He shrugged as if his words were nothing more than an innocent observation. "I was just thinking. It's interesting how people rush to thank and praise military personnel, even when they don't really know if they've done anything to deserve it." Danielle studied him, her brow furrowing slightly. For a brief moment, Julian thought she might lash out, but instead she took a deep breath and replied in a composed voice, each word emphasized with clarity. "I paid for my seat, Mr. Prescott. I didn't ask for any favors, and I certainly don't need anyone to hand me anything." Julian flinched slightly at the sound of his name. Danielle had clearly read it off his luggage tag or heard it from the attendant, and the deliberate use of his name felt like a subtle yet pointed reminder. "I'm not saying you begged for anything," Julian replied, but his tone grew sharper, betraying his irritation. "Still, you can't deny that wearing that uniform gets you treated like royalty without lifting a finger." Danielle set her glass down on the table in front of her, her dark eyes flashing with a quiet but fierce resolve. "Mr. Prescott," she began, her voice more deliberate now, "I don't wear this uniform for recognition or perks. I wear it because of the responsibility I've chosen to bear, because I've committed myself to something bigger than myself. It's not always easy, but I'm proud of what I do." Her words struck Julian like a slap to the face, but he wasn't ready to back down. The unease that had simmered since the start of the flight now churned into a storm of resentment. He hated this feeling, the sense that she held the upper hand in their exchange. "Proud, huh?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with a mocking tone. "I don't doubt you feel that way, but let's be real here. Everyone has responsibilities in life, but not everyone gets celebrated for them. Don't you think you're reaping a bit too much from all this?" Danielle's gaze locked onto his, her calm voice turning icy. "I don't need you to tell me what I've gained or lost. I've lost friends, time with my family, and more sleepless nights than I can count, questioning whether I've done enough or done things right. And what about you, Mr. Prescott? Have you ever done anything for someone else without thinking about what you'd get in return?" Her question hit Julian like a punch to the gut. He felt his whole body stiffen, his lips pressing into a tight line. He couldn't come up with a response right away. The tension between them was palpable, so much so that other passengers in the cabin could feel it, though none dared to intervene. Danielle turned away, her eyes drifting back to the photo of Caleb tucked into her pocket. This time, she said nothing more, yet her silence only deepened Julian's discomfort. Inside him, a strange feeling began to stir, not just annoyance but also a twinge of confusion, as though he'd just been outmaneuvered in a battle he thought he controlled. The flight continued, but between Julian and Danielle, the silence was no longer simple. It was the silence of an unresolved conflict, a clash not just between two individuals, but between beliefs and assumptions Julian had never expected to be challenged. The flight landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport, amid the murmurs of passengers hurriedly gathering their belongings and disembarking. Julian stood up, unconsciously adjusting his suit jacket as his gaze flickered toward the woman seated beside him. Danielle remained as composed as she had been throughout the flight, saying not a word since their earlier tense exchange. Stepping off the plane, Julian tried to shake off the lingering discomfort clouding his mind. "She's nobody," he told himself. "Just another soldier, and I didn't do anything wrong." But Danielle's last words still echoed in his head. "And what about you, Mr. Prescott? Have you ever done something for someone else without thinking of your own gain?" As Julian waited at the baggage carousel, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his notifications. One headline from a local news app caught his eye. "Sergeant Danielle Parker returns from emergency deployment, faces family tragedy as son battles critical illness." Julian's chest tightened. He opened the article, and the words on the screen unfolded a story that hit him like a punch. Danielle Parker, a single mother, had just returned from an overseas mission to be by the side of her only son, Caleb, who was suffering from a severe heart condition. The boy was undergoing treatment at a hospital in Atlanta, but needed a complex surgery to have any chance of survival. A photo of Caleb appeared on the screen. A frail boy with pale skin and large, innocent eyes looked into the camera from his hospital bed. Tubes and IV lines snaked around his tiny body, leaving Julian momentarily breathless. Danielle's expression from the flight suddenly flashed in his mind. The steely resilience mingled with an unspoken pain she had refused to let surface. Julian felt as though he'd been doused with cold water. The woman he had mocked, dismissed, and even belittled during the flight was actually bearing a personal tragedy he couldn't have fathomed. He kept reading, his hands tightening around his phone. The article recounted Danielle's sacrifices in the military, the years spent away from her son to fulfill her duty. It described Caleb's medical condition in detail. The boy needed urgent surgery, but military insurance wouldn't fully cover the costs. Julian felt a lump rise in his throat, but he resisted the emotion. "It's not my responsibility," he told himself. "Everyone has their struggles and they have to. Deal with them on their own." Yet Caleb's eyes in the photo haunted him, stirring something within, a feeling Julian couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was an uncomfortable sense of guilt, as though he had done something wrong he wasn't ready to admit. When Julian's sleek silver suitcase finally appeared on the carousel, he grabbed it quickly but lingered, his eyes returning to the phone screen. The image of Caleb and the article's words stayed there, an undeniable reminder. Julian walked out of the baggage claim area, his steps heavy. The airport's bustling noise seemed to fade, replaced by the chaotic swirl of his thoughts. His pride wouldn't let him admit outright that he'd been wrong. But a small part of him, a part he had buried long ago, started to question. Maybe she does deserve more than what I assumed. Julian didn't have an answer yet, but he knew one thing. The image of Caleb and Danielle's unwavering gaze would stay with him, no matter how hard he tried to forget. Stepping out of the airport, Julian slid into the waiting car, his face more contemplative than ever. The sound of honking horns and the bustling noise of Atlanta outside seemed to fade away, unable to reach him. On the screen of his phone, the article about Danielle Parker and her son Caleb remained open, the lines of text flickering faintly in the dim light of the car. Images of Caleb lying on the hospital bed kept replaying in his mind. The bright, yet fragile eyes, the innocent face that seemed to be looking straight at him. Julian leaned back in his seat, gripping his phone tightly. A strange mix of guilt and confusion gnawed at him. She's lost friends, been estranged from her family, and now she's fighting for her son, he muttered, recalling Danielle's words on the plane. They no longer sounded like accusations. Instead, they had become undeniable truths that Julian couldn't ignore. Julian had always prided himself on being practical, someone who knew how to put himself first. But now, that sense of self-importance felt hollow, meaningless in the face of a woman's plight, a woman he had once dismissed. Trying to shake off the heavy feeling, Julian decided to learn more about Danielle's fundraising campaign. A few taps on his phone brought up the online donation page. The title was brief but moving: "Help Caleb Fight Heart Disease." The page detailed Caleb's medical condition and the staggering cost of the surgery, making Julian pause. Even with military insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses were a daunting figure for any family. Julian scrolled through the list of donors. Name after name appeared. Ordinary people, each contributing anywhere from a few dozen to a few $100s, accompanied by messages like "praying for Caleb" or "wishing the little guy a speedy recovery." His eyes stopped at the current total, $37,000, still far from the $150,000 goal that Caleb's family desperately needed. Julian sighed and hovered over the donation amount field. He hesitated, his mind a battlefield between pride and remorse. "I'm not responsible for this," he told himself. But another part of him, small but insistent, countered, "Not being responsible doesn't mean you shouldn't help." At last, his finger settled on a number: $10,000. For Julian, a successful entrepreneur, the amount wasn't exorbitant. Yet, to him, it carried a deeper significance. It was the first step toward making amends, a way to ease the guilt that was eating away at him. He pressed the donate button, and the screen switched to a thank you page. A prompt appeared. "Would you like to leave a message?" Julian hesitated for a moment, then typed a simple note. "I hope your son gets well soon." He deliberately left it unsigned, choosing to remain in the shadows. He didn't want Danielle to know that the man sitting next to her on the flight was the one who made this contribution. "I don't need recognition," Julian told himself. But as he set his phone down, Julian realized the emptiness inside him hadn't vanished. While $10,000 was a significant sum, it wasn't enough to erase the feeling that he had been wrong, that this action was just a small piece in the puzzle of redemption. He rested his head against the car seat, closing his eyes. In the dim haze of his thoughts, the images of Caleb and Danielle lingered, a constant reminder that he couldn't turn away from this so easily. "Is this enough?" Julian wondered, and though he didn't say it aloud, he already knew the answer. The car came to a slow stop in front of Peachtree Children's Hospital in Atlanta. Julian sat inside, his gaze fixed on the building adorned with colorful symbols of cartoon characters. In stark contrast to the bright exterior, a storm quietly brewed within him. "Why am I here?" Julian wondered to himself. He had no obligation to be there, no reason to face the woman he had sarcastically dismissed just days earlier. Yet an inexplicable urge had pulled him to this place. Maybe I just need to see the boy once, to make sure he's okay. Julian stepped out of the car, adjusted his suit, and walked inside. He tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but each step made him feel increasingly out of place. After a brief explanation at the reception desk, Julian was escorted to the third floor, home to the pediatric cardiology department. The atmosphere was unnervingly quiet, punctuated only by the steady hum of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses. He stopped in front of room 312. Through the glass door, Julian saw Danielle sitting by the bedside. Sunlight streamed through the window, reflecting off her military uniform, though this time he didn't find it as off-putting as before. On the bed lay Caleb, a small boy with pale skin and a face glistening with sweat, but his eyes still sparkled with a surprising vitality. Julian took a deep breath and knocked lightly on the doorframe. Danielle looked up, her expression momentarily startled upon recognizing him. A flicker of guardedness crossed her face, but she quickly regained her usual composure. "Mr. Prescott?" Danielle asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "What are you doing here?" Julian stepped inside, keeping his tone low and sincere. I read the article about you and Caleb. I know I don't have any reason to be here, but I thought I needed to come." Danielle tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving him. "You needed to come? Why? I thought we said enough on the flight." Julian hesitated for a moment. He realized explaining his presence was much harder than he had anticipated. "I don't know. Maybe because—" He paused, meeting Danielle's gaze directly. "Maybe because I was wrong." Julian's admission caught Danielle off guard. The tension in her eyes softened, replaced by a hint of surprise. Still, her voice remained steady. "Wrong about what?" Julian took a deep breath, his hands clenched tightly. "About you. About what you've done. I think I misjudged you, and when I read about Caleb, I realized I couldn't just stay silent." Danielle stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the authenticity of his words. Finally, she gave a small nod. "All right. If you want to stay, I won't stop you." Julian felt a wave of relief, though it was mingled with awkwardness. He stepped further into the room, his eyes resting on Caleb, who was sleeping soundly amidst the surrounding medical equipment. "He's so strong," Julian murmured, unsure if he was speaking to Danielle or himself. Danielle sat back down, her eyes tender as they lingered on Caleb. "He has to be strong. He doesn't have a choice." Her words struck a chord in Julian, stopping him in his tracks. He sat down in the chair across from her, feeling as though he had stepped into a world he had never touched before. A world of pain, sacrifice, and unconditional love. The room fell into silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft glow of light filtering through the window. Yet, within that silence, Julian felt something begin to shift inside him, a change he couldn't yet name. The atmosphere in the hospital room 312 was becoming increasingly familiar to Julian. Since their first meeting, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. Caleb, frail but resilient, and Danielle, exhausted yet determined. What initially felt like an urge to ease his guilt had grown into something deeper, as though he now had a responsibility to their journey. One late afternoon, Julian returned to the hospital carrying a bag of coffee. I found Danielle holding a large stack of papers, her face tense with stress. It was a pile of insurance forms, medical bills, and other complicated documents. "What's going on?" Julian asked, setting the coffee cup down on the table. Danielle sighed, rubbing her temple. "Insurance paperwork. Some expenses aren't covered, and I need to apply for additional aid. But most of this stuff is so confusing. I don't have time to sort through it all while taking care of Caleb." Julian looked at the papers and sensed Danielle's frustration and exhaustion. Slowly, he said, "You know, I'm pretty good at handling complicated things like this. Let me help." Danielle looked up, her expression skeptical. "You want to help? Why?" Julian hesitated for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I realize I can do something, and for the first time I want to help without expecting anything in return." Though still uncertain, Danielle nodded and handed him the stack of papers. Julian sat down at the table and began flipping through the pages. His skills as a businessman, someone accustomed to analyzing numbers and navigating complex processes, were now being used for a different purpose, to help someone he once dismissed. In the days that followed, Julian dove into assisting Danielle with an enthusiasm that even surprised himself. He not only managed the insurance paperwork but also reached out to nonprofit organizations to seek additional financial support. Using his connections in the business world, he tracked down a top specialist with experience in rare cases like Caleb's. After multiple calls and emails, Julian succeeded in arranging an earlier consultation, something Danielle had thought impossible. One evening, as Julian walked into the hospital room with a new file from the specialist, Danielle looked at him with an expression that was no longer just gratitude. Placing her hand over her heart, she softly said, "I never thought you'd do all this. You've changed, Julian." Julian paused, the file trembling slightly in his hands. I don't even know why I'm doing this, but you're right. Maybe I have changed." Amid the hours spent working at the hospital, Julian began to notice something strange yet valuable. He felt genuinely happy helping others, not the kind of happiness that came from sealing a major deal or achieving financial gain, but the satisfaction of knowing he was doing the right thing. For the first time in his life, Julian realized that his business skills, his precision, decisiveness, and problem-solving abilities could be used to create positive change in someone's life. The feeling was both new and addictive. "Maybe this is what I've been missing all along," Julian thought as he left the hospital late one night. Gradually, Danielle also began to see Julian differently. She no longer viewed him solely as a man burdened by prejudice, but as someone striving to make amends, someone willing to stand by her side during the most challenging moments. "Thank you, Julian," Danielle said one day while Caleb was peacefully asleep. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Julian shook his head, his voice low but sincere. "Don't think about repaying me. I'm not doing this because I want anything from you. I'm doing this because I want to be a better person." Danielle smiled faintly, for the first time feeling she could trust Julian, not just as an ally in this arduous journey, but perhaps as a true friend. Meanwhile, Julian realized this journey wasn't just about helping Caleb or Danielle. It was also about discovering and confronting himself. The atmosphere in the hospital waiting room was so tense, it was almost suffocating. Danielle sat on a hard plastic chair, her hands tightly clasped together, her eyes fixed on the door to the operating room. Julian stood nearby, gripping his phone tightly but not using it. He didn't know what to do to ease the waves of anxiety crashing through him. Caleb had finally been taken into surgery, thanks to the top specialist Julian had managed to find. It was a small victory in a grueling journey, but now the weight of the operation's outcome loomed even larger. Danielle exhaled a faint sigh, breaking the oppressive silence. They said the surgery would take about 4 hours. So why does it feel like a lifetime? Julian sat down beside her, searching for words of comfort but unsure where to start. Consoling someone was entirely foreign to him, so different from the cold negotiations and polished presentations he had delivered hundreds of times. "He's a fighter," Julian said, his voice low and laden with meaning. "He has you, Danielle, and Caleb will get through this. I'm sure of it." Danielle turned to look at him, her eyes glistening under the dim hospital hallway lights. "Do you really think so?" Julian nodded, though the anxiety gnawing at him was no less intense than hers. "I'm not someone who easily believes in anything, but I believe in him." Time crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. Danielle stood, then sat, then paced the hallway in an attempt to steady herself. Julian, however, remained seated, his eyes glued to the door behind which the surgeons worked. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless, unable to influence or control the situation, a feeling he was completely unaccustomed to. When the clock reached the 4th hour, the operating room doors finally swung open. Danielle and Julian leapt to their feet, their eyes locked on the doctor stepping out, looking exhausted yet relieved. The surgery was successful, the doctor said, his voice warm but firm. "We were able to repair Caleb's congenital heart defect. He'll need close monitoring, but everything is progressing well." Danielle raised a hand to her mouth, a choked sob escaping before she could contain it. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Julian, standing beside her, felt an unfamiliar surge of emotion wash over him. His chest tightened, and for the first time in his life, tears began to spill. He turned away, trying to maintain his composure, but the pure joy of the moment was impossible to suppress. "Thank you," Danielle finally managed, her voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you, doctors, and—" She turned to Julian, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, Julian. I don't know what we would have done without you." Julian shook his head slightly, trying to hold back the flood of feelings overwhelming him. "I didn't do anything special. Caleb fought. He's the hero." But Danielle knew the truth was far more complicated. Without Julian, from navigating insurance logistics to connecting with the specialist, this entire ordeal would have been insurmountable. As Caleb was wheeled out of the operating room, still lost in the depths of anesthesia, Danielle clasped his small hand, feeling the warmth that assured her he was still there. She leaned down and whispered softly, "You did it, my love. You did it." Julian stood behind her, watching the scene with a newfound sense of reverence. In that moment, he realized that life wasn't just about contracts, numbers, or personal achievements. True life was here, in the eyes of a mother, in the revival of a fragile boy, and in the profound joy of knowing he had played a part in something miraculous. As they stood there, bathed in the dim light of the hospital corridor, Julian realized he had been changed forever. He hadn't just helped Caleb and Danielle, they had helped him rediscover the humanity he had long forgotten. The days following the surgery brought a noticeable change to the atmosphere in Hospital Room 312. The tension and anxiety gave way to hope and recovery. Caleb, though still frail, began to smile again, his eyes lighting up whenever someone walked into the room. Julian visited frequently. At first, his visits stemmed from a straightforward reason: to monitor Caleb's progress and ensure his efforts hadn't been in vain. But, over time, those visits became less about duty. He realized that his presence brought joy to Caleb, and, strangely enough, it brought joy to him as well. One morning, Julian arrived with a bag full of toys and books. He knocked softly on the door, a gentle smile crossing his face as he saw Caleb awake, his small hands clutching an old comic book. "Hey there, buddy," Julian said, setting the bag down on the table. "I thought we could use some new stories to read today." Caleb's face lit up, his big eyes darting to the bag. "Really, Uncle Julian? What's in there?" Julian chuckled, sitting down beside the boy. "A few comic books, a Lego set, and a little surprise I think you'll like." Carefully, Caleb rummaged through the bag and let out a delighted cry when he discovered a remote-controlled toy car. "I love this. Thank you so much." Moments like these became the norm. Caleb grew to see Julian as a close friend, or, more accurately, an uncle he could trust. And Julian realized that his affection for Caleb wasn't rooted in pity, but in genuine attachment, as though the boy were part of his own family. Danielle's attitude also began to shift. Initially, she maintained a cautious distance from Julian, worried that his generosity might come with strings attached. But over time, she saw that he had no intention of expecting anything in return. One evening, as Caleb slept soundly, Danielle sat in a chair by the window and looked at Julian with gratitude in her eyes. "You really didn't have to do all of this, Julian," she said softly. "But you did, and not just for Caleb, for me too. I never thought I'd have someone to lean on like this." Julian shrugged lightly, his gaze drifting to the window. "You know, Danielle, I used to think I had life all figured out, but meeting you and Caleb made me realize I knew nothing at all. Helping you both isn't something I feel obligated to do. It's something I want to do. It's as simple as that." Danielle smiled, for the first time seeing that Julian was no longer the cold, arrogant man she'd met on the plane. Between them, a slow but steady trust began to form, a bond not built on obligation, but on genuine connection. As the days passed, the relationship between the three deepened. Caleb started affectionately calling Julian Uncle Jules, while Danielle and Julian gradually became true companions. They didn't need to say much. Their shared glances and small gestures spoke volumes. One late afternoon, the three of them sat by Caleb's hospital bed, working together on a large Lego set Julian had brought. "What do you think we should build?" Danielle asked, smiling at Caleb. "A spaceship," Caleb exclaimed, his eyes shining, "and Uncle Jules will help me with the engines." Julian laughed, picking up a piece. "All right, but you have to make sure this spaceship doesn't crash when it takes off." The three of them burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the small room. In that moment, they resembled a real family, not bound by blood, but by the bond forged through shared struggles and triumphs. For the first time in his life, Julian felt that his existence had true meaning, not from career achievements or fame, but from finding his place in the hearts of a determined mother and her resilient son. In the soft glow of the setting sun, Julian thought quietly to himself, "Maybe this is what I've been searching for all along, a place to belong." As the twilight's glow streamed through the hospital window, Julian sat alone in the small cafe in the main lobby. The murmuring conversations around him couldn't pull him away from the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. He sipped his coffee, but the familiar bitter taste no longer brought him comfort. Instead, a different sensation was growing, an awakening he could no longer ignore. Staring out the glass window, Julian reflected on his life. The years he had spent building his career, climbing the ladder of success, step by step, proving his worth in the business world. He once believed everything he achieved was deserved, that he owed no one anything. But now, looking back, he recognized a truth he had long avoided. He had been granted immense privilege while barely considering who might be in need of help. The image of Caleb, with his bright, determined eyes, and Danielle, the mother who never stopped fighting for her son, revealed to Julian all that he had overlooked in life. He recalled the piercing look in Danielle's eyes during the flight, when she asked him what he had done for others without expecting something in return. That question now echoed in his mind like an indictment of his very soul. That evening, Julian returned to his apartment, leaving the lights off. He sat on the couch, staring into the void. He thought about the beliefs that had been ingrained in him, the idea that everyone should fend for themselves, that all success was purely the result of individual effort. But now, he understood not everyone starts from the same place, and sometimes those who seem undeserving are bearing burdens he could never imagine. Julian realized he needed to do more than just help Caleb and Danielle. It wasn't just about correcting a personal mistake, it was about leveraging his resources and abilities to create real change, not just for one person, but for many. A week later, at the company office, Julian walked into the boardroom with a stack of documents in hand. For the first time, he wasn't presenting on profits or market expansion strategies. Instead, he introduced a completely new plan. "I want our company to establish a social responsibility program," Julian said, his voice steady but sincere. "I believe we can use our resources to support military families, especially those with children battling serious illnesses. This isn't just about giving back to the community. It's about building a core value system we should stand for." The room fell silent. His colleagues, accustomed to seeing Julian as a profit-focused strategist, seemed stunned by this shift. "Julian, are you sure this is the direction we should take?" someone asked. Julian nodded, his eyes resolute. "I've never been more certain. We're not just in business to make money. We have a responsibility to the community we serve." After the meeting, Julian left the room feeling a sense of relief. He knew this was only the first step, but it was the right one. His plan wasn't limited to fundraising or donations. It included establishing long-term support programs, from providing medical care to creating educational opportunities for underprivileged children. With the leadership team's approval, Julian began collaborating with nonprofits and hospitals to implement the initiative. He personally participated in the program's design, unafraid to spend countless hours in meetings and on-site assessments. Julian discovered that he wasn't just changing his perspective on the world, he was changing himself. He was no longer the man who viewed everything through the lens of personal gain. Now he understood that real power didn't come from wealth or influence but from using them to do good for others. As he continued supporting Caleb and Danielle, Julian felt an unbreakable bond forming. They weren't his blood relatives, but they had become an integral part of his life, a living testament to change, not just in their circumstances but in his soul. During one of his visits to Caleb, the boy gently asked, "Uncle Jules, will you always be here?" Julian looked into the child's innocent eyes and smiled softly. "Of course, buddy. I'll always be here." In that moment, Julian knew he had found life's true meaning, not through lofty goals but through the connections and compassion he had once believed he didn't possess. After Caleb was discharged from the hospital, a new light seemed to flood the lives of all three of them. The routine checkups continued, but, unlike before, each visit to the hospital was now filled with hope. Caleb gradually recovered, regaining the health and innocence of a child. No longer confined to a hospital bed, he now ran around, laughing and playing with the remote-controlled car that Julian had given him. Julian kept his promise. He wasn't just a temporary friend during difficult times, but had become an indispensable part of Caleb and Danielle's lives. Despite his busy work schedule, Julian always found time to visit them, bringing small gifts for Caleb or simply sitting down to chat with Danielle. One Sunday afternoon, Julian visited Danielle's small apartment. The room was now brimming with life. Caleb's scribbled drawings were taped to the walls, small potted plants that Danielle had grown adorned the balcony, and the table was covered with Lego sets Caleb was assembling. Caleb ran out to greet Julian with a beaming smile. "Uncle Jules, look what I made." The boy pointed to a spaceship model he had built, his tiny hands still sticky with glue from earlier mistakes. Julian chuckled and ruffled Caleb's hair. "That's amazing, buddy. Looks like you're ready to launch into space." Danielle emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You really don't have to visit so often, Julian," she said, though her eyes were gentler than her words. "I don't want to impose on you." Julian took the coffee and sat down on the couch. "You're not imposing, Danielle. I'm here because I want to be, and if there's anything I can do for the 2 of you, I'll do it." Danielle was silent for a moment, her gaze resting on Caleb, who was happily playing with his model. "Caleb loves you, and so do I." Julian was surprised but simply smiled. "Thank you. I care deeply about both of you, too, not just because of what we've been through, but because you and Caleb have changed how I see life." Julian realized he had changed. He used to live for his career, for numbers, and for social status. But now, he lived for meaningful moments, for smiles, and for genuine connections. He looked at Danielle, a strong, independent woman who had once refused any help, but had now learned to open her heart. Julian knew that Danielle had endured a great deal of pain, yet she had retained a resilience he deeply admired. These visits with this small family not only brought joy to Caleb and Danielle, but also gave Julian a renewed sense of purpose. Every gesture, every word he shared with them no longer came from a sense of obligation, but from genuine sincerity. Julian often took Caleb to the park, where the boy could run freely under the sunlight. One time, as Caleb played on the swings, Danielle and Julian sat on a bench, talking. "Did you ever think life would bring us here?" Danielle asked, her eyes following Caleb. Julian thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I didn't, but I believe everything happens for a reason. Meeting you and Caleb changed me, Danielle. I'm not the same man I was at the beginning." Danielle smiled, her eyes soft in a way Julian had never seen before. "And I think Caleb and I have changed because of you, too." Julian didn't reply. He just looked over at Caleb, feeling a deep happiness welling up inside him. He wasn't just a man who had made mistakes. He had become someone Caleb could trust, someone Danielle could rely on. As the evening sunlight bathed the park in a golden glow, they sat there like a small, unconventional family bound together by the simplest yet most profound things: trust, sharing, and humanity. Julian knew he had found a new purpose in life, and he was determined never to lose it.